Well, none that'll surprise anybody. Obviously you want to lead an active life, try to walk or do some sort of aerobic activity several times a week, eat healthy, don't smoke. Generally speaking, for bypass grafting, we have to make a regular sternotomy incision because the grafts are on all different places in your heart, and we have to move your heart around. So there's a couple people in the country that try and do it robotically. Hasn't really taken off. Now with valves, we've made a ton of progress with valve surgery. So like the aortic valve, we can do most aortic valve surgery just with a catheter. So there's a bunch of, it depends on what exact operation you're talking about. So some areas we're just, leaping ahead, and other areas we're staying about the same. So for a stent, you stay on several medications. Stay on a beta blocker, a statin, aspirin, and the most stents in use today are called drug-eluting stents. And with drug-eluting stents, we use dual antiplatelet therapy. So the first thing is an aspirin, and the second one is usually a drug called Plavix or Brilinta or Effient, but they usually combine two antiplatelet drugs because there's some resistance to those drugs. You may stay on it for the rest of your life depending on the severity of your disease and what vessels are involved. At a minimum, you're going to stay on it for several months. Well, the second drug, you're going to stay on those other four for the rest of your life. And the second antiplatelet drug is going to be on for a period of months to potentially ever. Well, I think it's a pretty easy thing to do. If it's positive, it has a strong predictive value that you have a problem. If it's negative, you may not have a problem, but you could still have a problem. So, a lot of hospitals, centers are almost giving away the studies. So there's almost no downside to getting it. Depends on how bad the score is and the other health characteristics of the person. But if you have a very high score, it's a significant positive predictor of disease. So it's an easy thing. The main test we do, so you go from a calcium score, the next test is a stress test. So that's done by a cardiologist so that, you walking on a treadmill with an EKG lead on, or if you can't do all the parameters of the stress test, a nuclear medicine study. So you go from a test that, takes 90 seconds to do to a test performed by a specialist in their office with very specific interpretation. And then the test above that is the angiogram, which is an invasive procedure. So in terms of levels of difficulty of the test, most of the tests are up like this or up like this. The calcium score is down here. So it's not like the greatest test ever. It's also cheap and it takes 90 seconds to do. Yeah, so for what I do at Cabbage, well, I can tell you. So first of all, I'll take the STS data. So the STS data for a Cabbage it varies pretty much between about 0.5% and 2% for most people. We call, there's higher risk people that are, 4 or 5%. There's some super high risk people that are higher. Almost everybody is between 0.5 and 2% risk. My personal outcomes are slightly better than those national things. So in general, when you look at the risk-benefit analysis for Cabbage, it's pretty good. So you have a problem, when someone gets referred, there's been some things in the news media about like unnecessary treatments, this versus that. A lot of that is with stenting, with mild symptoms. By the time someone gets referred to me, 60% of the patients are admitted to the hospital. So, and a lot of the people who aren't admitted to the hospital have valve problems, which are more elective. But so most people I operate on, if they don't have something done to fix this, they face a high likelihood of a major disabling heart attack or death. And they're trading that against a 1.5% chance of not making it. So it's a pretty good risk benefit. Generally, no. So first of all, you have an operation, so it's a big deal. So you wake up and you go, thank God I'm alive. And then about 10 minutes later, you go, what did I just get into? And so you gotta get through that. And that takes a little bit of time. Some people move faster through it or not. But in general, you had a bad problem. And that problem is usually better. So your heart is working better. So you got an engine that's pumping. And that's different than a lot of other operations we do. Like your gallbladder, take your gallbladder or some of the other surgeries we do, you have a hernia. We go fix that, and that fixes that problem that's causing you some pain, but it doesn't help things overall. It doesn't help you breathe easier. I mean, your heart is the engine that drives everything. And so you go in, you get a tune-up, and that is really changing things for you. And so if you don't have complications with your operation and then you get through the recovery, you should feel better than you did before surgery. And that's the goal. So I used to do about 80% of my operations off pump. And what we found, so there's it's been going on. I started doing off-pump surgery in about, around 2000. And by about 2008, I was doing 80% of them off-pump. And what we found over time is there's a very small potential benefit to doing them off-pump because the pump has gotten so much better. And so the on-pump versus off-pump is about how well you do in the immediate post-operative period, in the first week after surgery. And so I've kind of modified my procedure. I mostly do beating heart surgery with the pump. The danger of off-pump surgery is that you have a conversion. So most people are doing better, but a couple percentage of people do much worse. And so if we go on pump, we eliminate those couple percent of people, and the downside to everybody else is almost non-measurable. And what we've sort of seen over time is you reduce your perioperative complications or difficulties, and what can we achieve in the long term? So that's what I was talking about with making sure the first thing is whatever you use for a graft, whether it's a vein or an artery, you want it to stay open. And so you want to measure it to make sure technically in the OR it's open. And then the second thing, you want to make sure people are taking the medications they need to take to keep the grafts open. And then the third thing that we're pushing for is to use more arterial conduits, these internal mammary arteries, so they stay open in the long run. When if you think about it, if you came up with a cancer medication that could increase long-term survival by 10 to 20%, for any common cancer, that'd be $1 billion a year product. And yet, in coronary disease, this option is basically ignored in the United States. It's an interesting sort of phenomenon. And so I've devoted a lot of my professional efforts towards these long-term outcomes because the perioperative things are already minuscule. Trying to change someone's stroke risk from 0.5% to 0.3% is something you'll never even see the difference in your career. You got to operate on 5,000 people to notice that difference. But I think if you increase someone's life expectancy by 10 to 20%, that's a big deal. So the literature says that they don't. Now they obviously cause some muscle pain in certain people, and you get pulled off it. So if you take a statin or any other medication and you start having problems with it, that's an indication to reconsider taking that medication. And so that certainly applies to statins. Now, the deal with statins is you take them for the rest of your life. They're pretty strong drugs. So people are starting to take them in their 50s. And if you want to live to be 85, which is, the general target, some of us want to live to be 95, but you could be on statins for 20, 30 years. Well, doing a study that looks at something for 20 to 30 years to determine an effect is, pretty hard to do. Usually 5 or 10 years into something, whatever we started on, there's something new. So getting 25-year outcomes is very difficult. But right now, the literature on statins really doesn't support that they cause major adverse things. Mostly, most of the responses are positive. The problem is when people get older, they start having all of these types of problems that you're naming, and they've been on a statin for 20 years, and so it's a statin cause. I think you shouldn't take lightly being on medications. So if you're on a statin because you have significant medical problems, well, you might not be alive if you don't take the statin. So that's a good thing, but you shouldn't take a statin just 'cause. So there's a dose response effect from aspirin. So baby aspirin or a full aspirin, you take a full aspirin, the chance of getting the antiplatelet effect is better than taking a baby aspirin. But you have to balance the dose of aspirin you take against the risk of bleeding. So some people can take a full aspirin, some people can take a baby aspirin. It's in that range. Taking less than a baby aspirin, there's not much shown to show that has any benefit. Most people don't have any problems with aspirin, and so the net benefit is positive for taking aspirin in the long term. But if you have problems with it, and the problems we see mostly are in the elderly population, women in particular, and so it's not a benign medication in that group. A 55-year-old guy, especially if he's a smoker and a diabetic, should probably throw aspirin into his mix to help him out.